A routine morning. Darius Durant loved the quiet rhythm of his early mornings. The hum of his alarm clock was the only sound piercing the silence of his small apartment as the sun barely crept over the horizon. He rose with practiced efficiency, splashing water on his face to chase away any lingering sleep. For Darius, wearing the blue postal uniform wasn't just a job, it was a source of pride. He represented stability and familiarity in a community that had come to rely on him. After a quick breakfast, Darius hopped into his postal van, the vehicle he considered his second home. The streets of Copper Hill were still asleep, only a few early risers waving as he made his rounds. As he delivered letters and packages, his interactions were often brief, but meaningful: a nod to a jogger, a smile at a dog walker, small gestures that filled his day with connection. The morning proceeded smoothly until Darius reached Elm Street. He felt a quiet anticipation as he approached Mrs. Thompson's house. Mrs. Thompson was one of the bright spots of his route, a woman who always had a kind word and a genuine interest in his life. She was the kind of person who would offer him a thermos of hot cocoa on a winter morning, or proudly show off her blooming roses in spring. As he pulled up to her house, however, Darius noticed something unusual. The front yard, typically well-maintained, looked slightly overgrown. Weeds peeked through the flower beds, and the mailbox was stuffed with letters. A small frown creased his forehead. It was unlike Mrs. Thompson to let things slip like this. He grabbed the small package addressed to her and walked up the path to the front door, noticing a faint odor as he approached. He rang the doorbell and waited, glancing around the yard. Silence stretched on, and he rang the bell again, adding a few firm knocks. Still, there was no response. Just as he turned to leave a note, he saw movement through the narrow window beside the door. Relief washed over him as the door slowly creaked open, but his relief quickly turned to shock. Mrs. Thompson stood before him, a shadow of her former self. Her silver hair, usually neatly brushed, was matted and greasy. Her once bright eyes appeared glassy, unfocused, and her clothing hung loosely, with alarming red stains on her pants. "Darius," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Darius forced a smile, masking his concern. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. I've got a package for you." She swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. As she struggled to steady herself, the door swung open wider, allowing Darius a glimpse inside. The living room, once immaculate, was now in disarray. Trash and discarded containers littered the floor, and the air was thick with a stale, sickly sweet odor that made his stomach turn. "Mrs. Thompson, are you feeling all right?" he asked gently. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," she replied, her words slurring slightly. "Just a bit under the weather." Darius's concern grew, but he didn't want to push too hard. "Is there someone I can call for you? Maybe a family member?" No, I'm fine," she insisted, though her weak smile did little to reassure him. She reached for the package with a trembling hand, but quickly lost her grip, nearly collapsing. Without hesitation, Darius steadied her. "Mrs. Thompson, I really think you need some help. Can I call someone for you?" She shook her head slowly, eyes drifting away. "Thank you, Darius. You're such a sweet boy. I just need rest." With that, she gently pushed the door shut, leaving Darius standing on the porch, heart pounding. As he walked back to his van, he couldn't shake the image of her frail figure, the stains on her clothing, and the unsettling state of her home. She was a proud woman, not one to let herself or her surroundings fall into disrepair. Darius climbed back into his van, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to process what he had seen. He wanted to respect her privacy, but the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave him. He took a deep breath, replaying their brief conversation in his mind. The Mrs. Thompson he knew was gone, replaced by someone fragile, someone in need of help, even if she didn't want to admit it. As he continued his route, his thoughts kept circling back to her. He went through the motions of his deliveries, but the concern gnawed at him. each stop a reminder of the kind woman he'd known, now just a shadow. By the time his lunch break rolled around, he knew he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. Darius pulled into the parking lot of Mabel's diner, his usual lunch spot, but even the smell of freshly brewed coffee and grilled sandwiches did little to stir his appetite. He slid onto a stool, staring blankly at the menu, lost in thought. "Hey there, Darius," Mabel called from behind the counter, her face creased with a welcoming smile. "The usual," he nodded absent-mindedly. "Yeah, thanks, Mabel." As Mabel set his plate down, she noticed his troubled expression. "You all right, hon? You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Darius sighed, glancing up. "I'm worried about Mrs. Thompson on Elm Street. She didn't look well today, and her house. It's not like her at all." Mabel's smile faded, concern flickering in her eyes. "Jane Thompson. I haven't seen her at church in weeks. Usually, she's there every Sunday." Darius's stomach tightened. "That's what I was afraid of. She told me she was fine, but something's not right." Mabel reached across the counter, patting his hand. "Darius, sometimes it takes an outsider to notice when something's wrong. Trust your gut. If you feel something's off, maybe you should go back and check on her." Darius nodded slowly, Mabel's words echoing in his mind. He had a duty to his community, a responsibility to the people who'd come to depend on him. Mrs. Thompson had always treated him with kindness and respect. Now it was his turn to look out for her. Determined, he climbed back into his van after lunch, the image of Mrs. Thompson's frail figure lingering in his mind. He knew he had to go back, and this time he wouldn't leave until he was sure she was safe. As Darius drove towards Elm Street, a sense of foreboding settled over him. He couldn't predict what he would find, but he knew he had to be there for her, even if it meant stepping into a situation beyond his comfort zone. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest actions could make the biggest difference. The second visit. Darius Durant couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. His hands felt clammy as he gripped the steering wheel, heading back toward Elm Street with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he was overstepping his duties as a mailman, but the image of Mrs. Thompson's frail, trembling figure haunted him. The stains on her pants, the unkempt yard, the stale odor, all were red flags he couldn't ignore. As he pulled up in front of her house for the second time that day, the sun hung high in the sky, casting stark shadows that emphasized the untidy state of her property. Her mailbox was overflowing with uncollected mail, some letters yellowed at the edges from days in the sun. The familiar, well-kept lawn was now dotted with weeds and untrimmed hedges, a sad reflection of Mrs. Thompson's current state. Darius stepped out of his van, his pulse quickening as he approached the front door. This time, he knocked firmly, his mind racing with scenarios of what might lie on the other side. Seconds turned into minutes as he waited, pressing his ear to the door for any sound of movement within. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's Darius, your mailman. I just wanted to check on you." A long, tense silence followed. Darius tried the doorbell again, the chime muffled and distant, echoing through the quiet house. He pressed his lips into a thin line, resisting the urge to panic. Mrs. Thompson was always quick to answer, eager to greet him. Her absence felt like a gaping hole, a silent cry for help that he was now responsible for answering. After a few more futile attempts at knocking, Darius took a step back, glancing at the house next door. Mr. Jenkins, her elderly neighbor, was usually around, tending to his garden or sitting on his porch. Spotting him, Darius walked over, hoping for some insight. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," Darius called, forcing a polite smile. "Do you have a minute?" Mr. Jenkins looked up from his rose bushes, his face etched with concern as he met Darius's gaze. "Afternoon, Darius. You look troubled. Is something the matter?" Darius hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I'm worried about Mrs. Thompson. I haven't seen her in a while. And her house. Well, it doesn't look like she's been able to keep up with things. Have you seen her recently?" Mr. Jenkins scratched his head, his eyes clouding with worry. "Come to think of it, I haven't seen Jane out and about for a couple of weeks now. She usually tends to her garden every day, but I assumed she was just staying indoors because of the heat." Darius's concern deepened. "She didn't look well when I saw her this morning. She seemed different, not herself. And the house is in a state I've never seen before." Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. "Jane's always been so independent, but we all slow down eventually. If she's not answering her door, something must be wrong." Darius felt a surge of urgency. "I think I should check inside, Mr. Jenkins, but I don't want to invade her privacy. Maybe I should call for help." The older man nodded thoughtfully. "It might be best. Jane's a proud woman, but if something's truly wrong, she'll need assistance." With Mr. Jenkins's support, Darius knew what he had to do. He walked back to his van, pulling out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen as he dialed 911, his heart thudding in his chest. He took a deep breath, silently hoping he wasn't overreacting. When the dispatcher answered, Darius explained the situation, detailing everything he'd observed that morning: the uncollected mail, the state of her home, and her deteriorated appearance. The dispatcher listened attentively, assuring him they would send an officer for a welfare check and an ambulance in case medical assistance was needed. As he ended the call, Darius felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He'd done everything he could, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was more dire than he realized. Now, all he could do was wait. The wait felt agonizingly long, every passing second amplifying his concern. Finally, he heard the distant wail of sirens, the sound growing louder until a police cruiser and an ambulance pulled up in front of Mrs. Thompson's house. The officer, a tall woman with a steady demeanor, stepped out of the cruiser, her eyes scanning the scene before landing on Darius. "Are you the one who called this in?" she asked, her tone professional but not unfriendly. Darius nodded, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "Yes, Mom. I'm Darius, her mailman. I tried knocking, but she hasn't been herself lately, and I couldn't just walk away." The officer gave him an understanding nod. "You did the right thing, Darius. We'll handle it from here." She turned and approached the house, her hand resting lightly on her radio as she motioned for the paramedics to follow. Darius stayed back, watching as she knocked on the door, her voice firm and calm as she called out Mrs. Thompson's name. When there was no response, she signaled to one of the paramedics, and together they attempted to open the door, finding it unlocked. As the door swung open, a faint, stale odor wafted out, carrying the same sickly sweetness Darius had noticed earlier. His stomach twisted as he watched the officer step inside, her expression shifting from professionalism to one of quiet horror. The paramedics exchanged a glance, then entered after her. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Darius waited outside, his mind racing. He glanced over at Mr. Jenkins, who had joined him on the curb, his face etched with worry. After what felt like an age, the officer emerged, her face solemn. She approached Darius and Mr. Jenkins, her voice softened by empathy. "Mrs. Thompson is alive, but she's in critical condition," the officer said. "It appears she's been neglecting her health for quite some time. The paramedics are going to take her to the hospital. It's a good thing you called when you did." Darius felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering concern. "Thank you, officer. Will she be all right?" The officer nodded, though her eyes reflected uncertainty. "She'll receive the care she needs now. It looks like she's been suffering in silence, likely too proud to ask for help. You might have saved her life today." Darius felt a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. He was relieved that Mrs. Thompson would get the help she needed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have noticed sooner, that he should have been more proactive in checking on her well-being. As the paramedics wheeled Mrs. Thompson out on a stretcher, Darius caught a glimpse of her face. She was pale and gaunt, her eyes closed, her once vibrant spirit, a shadow of what he remembered. He took a step closer, feeling a pang of sadness for the woman who had once brightened his day with her warm smile and gentle words. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Darius stood on the curb, lost in thought. He knew Mrs. Thompson would be cared for, but he couldn't shake the heaviness that settled in his chest. Her situation was a stark reminder of how easily people could slip through the cracks, unnoticed, even in a small, tight-knit community. Mr. Jenkins placed a reassuring hand on Darius's shoulder. "You did a good thing today, son. Not everyone would have gone out of their way to help." Darius managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I wish I had noticed sooner." "Sometimes, all we can do is act when we see the signs," Mr. Jenkins replied gently. "What matters is that you stepped up when it counted." Darius nodded, his gaze still lingering on the spot where the ambulance had been. In his heart, he knew that his role as a mailman had given him a unique perspective on the lives of the people he served, and today it had reminded him of the responsibility he bore, not just to deliver letters and packages, but to be vigilant, to care, and to notice the subtle changes that others might overlook. As he climbed back into his van, he resolved to pay closer attention to the people along his route, to recognize the quiet signs of struggle, and reach out when he could. Mrs. Thompson's ordeal had been a wake-up call, a reminder that sometimes kindness and vigilance could mean the difference between life and death. With one last glance at the empty house, Darius started his van, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He drove away, feeling both the satisfaction of having helped and the sobering realization that there were likely others, just like Mrs. Thompson, who were quietly struggling in silence, waiting for someone to care. Unseen struggles. For days after Mrs. Thompson's rescue, Darius found himself haunted by the image of her frail, lifeless figure on that stretcher. Though he'd been reassured by the paramedics and the police officer that his actions had likely saved her life, the guilt and weight of the experience lingered. The close-knit town of Copper Hill was abuzz with rumors about the elderly woman on Elm Street, each neighbor speculating on what had brought her to that state. Darius continued his rounds, the familiar rhythm of his deliveries both a comfort and a constant reminder of the incident. He found himself looking more closely at the homes he visited, noticing the subtle signs of neglect or loneliness in ways he hadn't before. A house with a mailbox overflowing with mail, a doorbell that had gone unanswered for weeks, or a front lawn that looked more overgrown than usual. All details that he now understood could be cries for help. On one of his morning rounds, he paused in front of Mrs. Thompson's empty home. The door had been locked, the blinds pulled down, and the yard still carried signs of disarray. Her absence left an unsettling quiet in the neighborhood, a void where her warmth and kindness used to reside. His mind wandered back to the small interactions he'd had with her over the years. Her laugh as she told him stories about her late husband, the way she would carefully prepare homemade cookies around the holidays just for him, and her words of encouragement when he shared his dreams of one day traveling the world. She had been more than just a stop on his route. She had been a friend. Determined to check on her, Darius decided to visit Copper Hill General Hospital after his shift. He felt a responsibility to know how she was doing, to see if she had someone by her side. She'd been such a staple of his daily life, and he couldn't shake the worry that she might be alone now, just as she had been before. The hospital was a stark, sterile contrast to the familiar warmth of Copper Hill. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, and the hallways were filled with the quiet bustle of nurses, doctors, and visitors moving from one room to another. Darius made his way to the front desk, nervously adjusting the collar of his postal uniform. "Excuse me," he said softly to the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "I'm here to visit a patient. Her name is Jane Thompson. I'm her mailman. I just wanted to check on her." The receptionist gave him a curious look, but nodded. "One moment, please." She tapped away on her computer, her fingers clicking rhythmically. "Room 304. She's on the third floor, down the hall to the right. She's in stable condition, but, well, I'm sure she'll appreciate seeing a familiar face. Darius's heart swelled with relief and a hint of anxiety. As he made his way to her room, he rehearsed what he would say. How did one express concern without prying? How could he reassure her that he genuinely cared without crossing boundaries? Outside room 304, he took a deep breath before gently knocking on the door and stepping inside. The room was bright, filled with the soft beeps and hums of medical equipment. Mrs. Thompson lay in the bed, her small frame appearing even more fragile against the white sheets. Her eyes were closed, and her once vibrant face looked weary, lined with the marks of both age and recent hardship. For a moment, Darius considered leaving quietly, not wanting to disturb her rest. But as he turned to go, her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked slowly, focusing on him. A faint smile curved her lips as recognition dawned in her tired eyes. "Darius," she murmured, her voice soft but warm. "You came." Darius smiled, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I was worried about you. I couldn't just go on my route without checking in." Her smile widened, though her eyes grew misty. "You've always been so kind, dear. I'm sorry you had to see me like that." "Not myself." Darius shook his head, his voice gentle. "There's nothing to apologize for. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. You've been like family to me, Mrs. Thompson." She reached for his hand, her fingers thin and cold but comforting. "You're a good man, Darius. I didn't know anyone cared enough to notice." The vulnerability in her words broke his heart. He struggled to find the right response, swallowing back a swell of emotion. "Everyone in the community cares about you. You've touched so many lives, Mrs. Thompson." They sat in silence for a few moments, both finding solace in the quiet connection they shared. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "After my husband passed, it became so hard to keep up with everything. I thought I was managing. But—" She trailed off, glancing toward the window, where the late afternoon sun cast a gentle glow over the room. "I suppose I didn't want anyone to see me so weak. It was easier to just fade into the background." Darius's heart ached for her. The pride and independence that had once made her so resilient had also kept her isolated, hidden from the help she so desperately needed. "You're not weak, Mrs. Thompson. You're one of the strongest people I know. Asking for help doesn't make you any less strong." She gave him a grateful look, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Darius. You're a blessing in my life. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come by that day." Darius felt a surge of relief, knowing he had done the right thing. "I'm just glad you're safe now. You have people who care about you, people who want to help." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. "It's strange, isn't it? How you can feel so alone, even when you're surrounded by others. My friends and neighbors. Wonderful people, all of them. But I didn't want to be a burden." Darius squeezed her hand gently. "You're not a burden. None of us would ever think that. We're here for each other. That's what community is about." Her eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed his hand back. "I don't know what I did to deserve a friend like you, Darius. Thank you for not giving up on me." They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about happier times, discussing the flowers she wanted to plant in her garden, and even sharing a few laughs. Darius could see a spark returning to her eyes, a glimpse of the woman she had once been, the woman he had admired on his daily route. As visiting hours ended, he reluctantly stood to leave. "I'll be back soon, Mrs. Thompson, and I'll make sure your mailbox is cleared out too," he promised with a wink. She chuckled softly. "Thank you, Darius. I'll be looking forward to it." As he exited the room, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a warmth that came from knowing he had made a difference. Mrs. Thompson would recover, and perhaps her life would be a little brighter now, knowing she wasn't alone. The following day, as he resumed his route, Darius found himself approaching his job with a new sense of purpose. Every stop became an opportunity to connect, to be vigilant. and to make a difference. He noticed the small things: a neighbor who looked tired, a yard that seemed neglected, a familiar face he hadn't seen in a while. He understood now that his role was more than just delivering letters. He was a thread in the fabric of his community, a source of connection and care. A few weeks later, Mrs. Thompson returned home. She greeted Darius from her porch, her silver hair neatly combed, her eyes shining with gratitude. Though she was still frail, there was a new strength in her, a resilience that came from knowing she was valued and cared for. As Darius waved goodbye, he realized that he had learned just as much from Mrs. Thompson as she had from him. Her vulnerability had taught him the importance of being present, of noticing the quiet struggles that others often hid, and in helping her, he had discovered the true power of empathy and community. With a light heart and a newfound sense of responsibility, Darius continued on his route, ready to face each day with the knowledge that even the smallest gestures of kindness could leave a lasting impact on the lives of those he served, a ripple through the community. The story of Darius and Mrs. Thompson spread quickly through the community of Copper Hill, with many neighbors stopping him on his rounds to ask about the elderly woman. Copper Hill was a small town, and news like this traveled fast. People were astonished to hear how close she had come to slipping through the cracks, hidden in plain sight by her own pride and independence. Darius's simple act of concern had sparked conversations all over town, making residents more mindful of each other's well-being. Darius noticed the shift on his daily route. Some neighbors waved him down to chat, offering their own stories of struggles, challenges, and loneliness. People who had once just given a quick nod now lingered, as if reminded of the importance of their interactions. Even children seemed to sense the change, some of them running up to him to say hello or show him a drawing they'd made. The warmth and openness he encountered each day reassured him that his community was one where people genuinely cared. But the biggest change was within himself. Where he once saw his rounds as a job, he now viewed them as a responsibility, an opportunity to connect with and protect the people in his care. The memory of Mrs. Thompson, her frail figure, her struggle to admit she needed help, had left an indelible mark on him. He was more observant, more willing to pause and engage, and he began to understand how deeply people's lives could be woven together in unexpected ways. One sunny morning, a few weeks after Mrs. Thompson returned home, Darius was surprised to see her standing on her front porch as he approached her house. She looked much better. Her hair was brushed, and she was wearing a clean, pressed dress that matched the warm glow of the late summer sun. She smiled and waved as he pulled his van to a stop. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Darius called, grabbing her mail and stepping out of the van with a wide grin. "Good morning, dear," she replied, her voice stronger and more lively than he had heard it in a long time. "I've been waiting for you. I baked some cookies as a thank you, and I wanted to give them to you in person." Darius felt a rush of warmth as he took the small tin she held out to him, the sweet scent of chocolate and butter wafting from the box. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm just glad to see you're doing better." She gave a small nod, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved my life, Darius. I was in a dark place, thinking that no one would notice if I just faded away. But you noticed. You reminded me that I'm still a part of this community." Darius smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "You're more than just a part of it. People here care about you. I care about you. We're all here for each other." They shared a comfortable silence, standing side by side on her porch, both of them feeling the weight of the bond that had grown between them. Finally, Mrs. Thompson spoke, her voice softer. "I've decided to make some changes, Darius. I reached out to my daughter, and she's coming to visit next week. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, too proud to let her see me like that. But I realized, with your help, that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. Sometimes it takes more strength to admit you need others." Darius felt a surge of pride. "That's wonderful, Mrs. Thompson. I'm sure she'll be glad to see you and know that you're doing better." She looked off into the distance, her expression wistful. Yes, I think so. And I'm thinking of joining the senior community center in town. They offer activities, and I could use a bit more company these days. It's time I stopped isolating myself. Darius nodded, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. Her words reinforced the importance of his role in the community. He realized that while he had simply done what felt right, his actions had encouraged her to reconnect with life in a meaningful way. Over the next few days, Darius noticed more changes throughout Copper Hill. Inspired by Mrs. Thompson's story, neighbors began to reach out to one another in small but impactful ways. One elderly man, Mr. Alvarez, asked Darius to deliver a note to his neighbor, inviting him to join him for a morning walk. A mother asked Darius if he'd seen her son, who had been feeling lonely and withdrawn. It seemed that everyone was paying more attention, finding ways to connect and show kindness. Even local businesses joined in. The owner of Copper Hill Cafe started offering a weekly neighbors' coffee hour on Sunday mornings, encouraging people to come in, share stories, and enjoy coffee on the house. People who had once been strangers began sharing conversations, laughing over coffee, and discovering common interests. Darius was proud to see his town coming together, especially knowing that he had played a part in it. He felt more purpose in his work than ever before, knowing he had become a bridge between people who might otherwise have remained isolated. Each day, he walked his route with a lighter heart, greeting his neighbors, chatting with children, and exchanging nods of camaraderie with those he passed. But while the change in the community was heartwarming, Darius's bond with Mrs. Thompson remained one of the most meaningful outcomes of his journey. He visited her often, bringing small tokens, a new magazine, a fresh flower from his garden, a loaf of bread from a local bakery. Each visit was met with her bright smile and a story or two about her life. She shared tales of her youth, her late husband, and her dreams for the future, which now included reconnecting with her family and even taking part in a community garden project. During one of his visits, Mrs. Thompson pulled out an old photo album, flipping through pages that captured her life across the decades. Darius listened intently as she narrated each memory, her voice a mixture of nostalgia and pride. "This was me and my husband, Richard," she said, pointing to a faded black and white photograph of a young couple standing by a lake. Her eyes softened as she looked at the image. "He was my everything. Losing him was like losing a piece of myself." Darius nodded, understanding more clearly why she had struggled in his absence. "I wish I could have met him. He sounds like a wonderful man." "He was," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know he'd want me to keep living, to find happiness even without him. And thanks to you, I'm finally ready to do that." Darius felt humbled by her words. He realized that sometimes a simple act of kindness could heal wounds that ran deeper than anyone realized. Helping Mrs. Thompson had not only saved her, but had also given her the courage to embrace life again. One rainy afternoon, as Darius walked his route with an umbrella shielding him from the drizzle, he saw a group of neighborhood children running towards him, laughing and shouting his name. They gathered around him, their faces bright with excitement. "Mr. Darius, Mr. Darius, did you hear? Mrs. Thompson is having a party," one of the kids exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. Darius raised an eyebrow, surprised. "A party? Really?" The kids nodded enthusiastically. "She invited the whole street. She said it's to celebrate her new start." A smile spread across Darius's face. Mrs. Thompson had come so far, and now she was celebrating with the people she once avoided. He felt a surge of pride and joy for her. As he finished his route, he looked forward to the event, eager to see her surrounded by friends and neighbors who would be there to celebrate her resilience. The evening of the party arrived, and Darius walked to Mrs. Thompson's house, feeling a warmth that came not only from the sense of community, but also from the knowledge that his actions had helped spark this transformation. The house was lit up, and the sounds of laughter and music spilled out into the street. Inside, he found Mrs. Thompson dressed in a bright floral dress, her hair styled neatly, and her face glowing with happiness. She moved from guest to guest, sharing stories and laughter, her spirit as vibrant as the decorations adorning her home. When she spotted Darius, her smile grew even wider. She walked over and hugged him tightly, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Darius, this is all because of you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Darius smiled, his own eyes misting with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Thompson. I'm just glad to see you happy." As they stood among friends, Darius realized that this journey had changed him as well. It had shown him the strength of community, the importance of empathy, and the incredible impact that even small acts of kindness could have. From that day on, he would carry Mrs. Thompson's story with him as a reminder of the power of connection and the quiet, unseen struggles that people often bore in silence. Copper Hill was no longer just a place he worked. It was a place he belonged, a place where he knew he was making a difference, one house, one conversation, one letter at a time. The true meaning of connection. The evening of Mrs. Thompson's New Start party left a profound impact on Darius. He went home that night with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling more connected to Copper Hill than ever before. Mrs. Thompson's journey from loneliness and despair to celebration and community was a testament to the power of human connection and resilience. Her story had resonated not only with Darius, but with many others in the neighborhood. For days afterward, people shared their own versions of her struggle, reinforcing the sense of togetherness that was growing within Copper Hill. The next morning, as Darius set out on his route, he felt the usual warmth and familiarity of the town, but it was layered with something new: pride. Pride in his role as a mailman, pride in the community, and pride in knowing he had been able to make a difference, however small. His perspective on his daily routine had fundamentally changed. Every house he approached felt like more than just a stop on his route. It felt like a chance to ensure no one was left unnoticed. As he reached the edge of Elm Street, he noticed an elderly man sitting on his porch, a few houses down from Mrs. Thompson's. The man, Mr. Alvarez, had lived there for years, but Darius realized he had rarely spoken with him beyond a casual nod. Feeling a newfound commitment to his role, Darius decided to take a moment and check in. "Good morning, Mr. Alvarez," Darius greeted him, waving as he approached. The older man looked up, his face brightening as he recognized the familiar blue postal uniform. "Ah, Darius, good morning. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Darius smiled, nodding. "It sure is. How've you been, Mr. Alvarez?" Mr. Alvarez gave a soft sigh, his gaze drifting over his front yard. "Oh, I've been managing. It's a bit lonely here since my wife passed a few years ago. The kids are grown and have their own lives, you know. Sometimes it feels like it's just me and this old house." Darius felt a pang of empathy, recognizing the same isolation that had once weighed down Mrs. Thompson. "I understand. It's easy to feel alone, even with people around. But I'm glad you're here. You're part of this community, Mr. Alvarez, and people here care about you." Mr. Alvarez's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Darius. I didn't realize anyone really noticed. This town feels like a family sometimes, but it can still feel distant when you're on your own." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "You know, if you ever want some company, we have a new Sunday coffee hour at Copper Hill Cafe. A lot of neighbors have been stopping by just to chat. I think you'd enjoy it." The older man's smile grew. "That sounds nice. I think I will." As Darius left Mr. Alvarez's porch, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Copper Hill wasn't just his route, it was his extended family. He realized that people like Mr. Alvarez and Mrs. Thompson had carried untold stories of loneliness, hidden behind polite smiles and small pleasantries. His role as a mailman was giving him a unique opportunity to break through those facades and remind them that they weren't alone. Later that week, Darius received an invitation in his mailbox from Mrs. Thompson. The invitation was handwritten in her elegant cursive, each word carefully chosen. It invited him to a neighbor's appreciation dinner. she was hosting in her home. The note mentioned that she wanted to thank him in a way that would allow her to show her gratitude more personally. The following Saturday evening, Darius arrived at her home, carrying a bouquet of flowers as a small token of appreciation. Mrs. Thompson welcomed him at the door, her face glowing with a happiness he hadn't seen in months. Her home, once shrouded in neglect, was now bright and lively, with fresh flowers on the table and the scent of a homemade meal filling the air. "Oh, Darius, these flowers are beautiful." "Thank you," she said, smiling warmly as she took the bouquet. "You're welcome, Mrs. Thompson. I'm just glad I could be here tonight." "Thank you for inviting me," Darius replied, feeling a familiar warmth in her presence. As he stepped inside, he noticed that several other neighbors had also gathered. Mr. Jenkins, the neighbor who had helped him check on Mrs. Thompson initially, gave him a nod from across the room. Mr. Alvarez, the elderly man from down the street, sat near the window, chatting with some of the other guests. Mrs. Thompson's daughter, who had recently come to town, was also present, assisting her mother in the kitchen and exchanging stories with the guests. As they all settled around the dining table, Mrs. Thompson raised a glass, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone here, especially Darius," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "This time last month, I was in a very dark place. I didn't think anyone would notice if I just faded away. But Darius did notice. He reminded me that I'm not alone and that I have people who care about me." Darius felt a wave of emotion wash over him, humbled by her words. Mrs. Thompson continued, her gaze sweeping over each person at the table. "And not only did he help me, but he brought all of us together. It's easy to get lost in our own lives. But tonight, I feel surrounded by family. I've learned that asking for help isn't a weakness. It's a strength, and knowing that I have people who care gives me strength every day." Everyone raised their glasses in a toast, their voices filled with warmth and camaraderie. The evening was filled with laughter and heartfelt conversations. Each person shared stories of their own, stories of struggles and triumphs, creating a space where vulnerability and kindness flowed freely. Darius was struck by the connections that had blossomed within this small group. The dinner turned into a gathering of shared experiences, a collective acknowledgement of the importance of community. He realized that these simple moments of togetherness had the power to heal, to bridge the gaps between lives that often ran parallel but seldom intersected. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson walked Darius to the door, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Thank you, Darius," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "Not just for that day you came by, but for everything you've done since. You've given me back a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going." Darius smiled, his own heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I never expected that just doing my job would lead to something like this. I'm the one who's grateful." As he walked home that night, Darius felt a deep contentment that he hadn't experienced before. The evening had reaffirmed his belief in the quiet, often unseen power of community. His actions had not only saved Mrs. Thompson's life, but had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to look out for one another and fostering bonds that would continue to grow. The following days were filled with small but meaningful gestures throughout Copper Hill. Neighbors checked on each other more often. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other with familiarity. The town had become more connected, each person a thread in the fabric of something greater. Darius continued his route, more observant than ever, looking for those small signs that might indicate someone in need. His role as a mailman had transformed into something far more significant. He was a caretaker, a listener, a friend. Each day, he carried not only letters and packages, but also the responsibility of watching over his community. One afternoon, as he stopped by Mrs. Thompson's house, she handed him a small envelope, her eyes twinkling. "It's just a little note," she said, smiling. "Something to remind you of the impact you've had here." Darius opened it once he returned to his van. Inside, he found a handwritten letter from Mrs. Thompson, thanking him once again for his kindness his persistence, and his friendship. Her words spoke of a gratitude so profound that it left him speechless. She ended the letter with a single line that would stay with him forever. "You showed me that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the ones that save lives." Darius folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the inside pocket of his uniform. It would be a reminder, on days when his job felt mundane, or when he questioned his role, of the lives he had touched and the difference he had made. As he drove away, he glanced at the streets of Copper Hill, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. This town was no longer just a place where he worked. It was a place where he had found his purpose, a place where he belonged. And with every house, every face, and every moment of connection, Darius knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A legacy of kindness. Several months had passed since that fateful day when Darius had noticed the signs of neglect and loneliness at Mrs. Thompson's home. The experience had not only reshaped his approach to his job, but also deepened his understanding of what it truly meant to be part of a community. The days were cooler now, the golden hues of autumn leaves beginning to blanket Copper Hill, adding a quiet beauty to his daily route. And with each step, each delivery, he found himself seeing more than just houses and mailboxes. He saw stories, lives, and connections that were woven together like a tapestry. The transformation in Copper Hill was remarkable. Inspired by Darius's example, residents had begun to check in on each other more frequently. Neighbors who had once only exchanged polite nods now looked out for one another, forming new bonds and nurturing a collective spirit of care and empathy. The small town felt more connected, more alive. People found comfort in knowing that someone was always nearby, willing to listen or lend a helping hand. Darius felt this shift each day as he walked his route. Every morning there were friendly waves, warm greetings and smiles that reminded him of the impact he had made. But it wasn't just the residents who had changed. Darius himself had grown in ways he hadn't expected. The sense of responsibility that had once felt like a burden now felt like a privilege, an honor to serve and protect the people in his community. As autumn drifted into winter, Darius continued his rounds, braving chilly winds and the occasional snowfall. Copper Hill, with its close-knit community and quiet charm, felt like home in a way it never had before. The relationships he had built with residents, each interaction layered with care and familiarity, warmed him even on the coldest days. One morning, as he was delivering mail to a house on Maple Street, he spotted a group of young children building a snowman in their front yard. They waved excitedly as he passed, one of them running up to him with a broad grin. "Hi, Mr. Darius, do you want to help us with our snowman?" the little boy asked, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Darius chuckled, setting down his mail bag. Of course, every snowman needs a little help, right? For the next few minutes, he joined the children, rolling snow into place and helping them shape a scarf from an old piece of fabric. As they finished, he looked around at the small, joyful group and felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. This was more than just a job. It was his community, his family, his legacy. One day, just before Christmas, Mrs. Thompson invited him over for tea. Her house was decorated with warm lights, and the smell of pine filled the air. She greeted him with a hug, her eyes twinkling with happiness. They sat together in her cozy living room, sipping tea as she shared stories of past holiday seasons. She showed him old photo albums, each picture capturing a moment of joy, family gatherings, and laughter. As they talked, he realized that Mrs. Thompson had not only regained her zest for life, but had also become a beacon of strength and resilience in the community. "Darius," she said softly, setting her cup down, "I wanted to tell you that I've decided to host a holiday gathering for the entire neighborhood. It's something I'd always wanted to do, but I was too afraid. You've given me the courage to do things I never thought I'd be able to again." Darius smiled, feeling honored. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Thompson. I'll be there." She nodded, a hint of emotion in her gaze. "It's because of you, you know. You've inspired all of us." The neighborhood gathering was a beautiful event. Mrs. Thompson's home was filled with people, laughter echoing through the rooms as friends, family, and neighbors came together. Darius looked around, marveling at how the community had transformed in such a short time. People who had once been strangers were now sharing stories, supporting one another, and building new memories. As he mingled with the guests, he overheard snippets of conversations that filled him with pride. People were talking about plans to volunteer at the local shelter, initiatives to support elderly neighbors, and ideas for community projects. He realized that the kindness he had shown Mrs. Thompson had sparked a ripple effect, one that was now deeply embedded in the fabric of Copper Hill. Later that evening, Mrs. Thompson raised a toast, her voice strong and confident. "To Darius," she began, her eyes sweeping the room, "who taught us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the world." The guests raised their glasses, their voices joining in a warm chorus. "To Darius." Darius felt a lump in his throat, humbled by the gratitude and love surrounding him. He had never sought recognition or praise. He had only wanted to do what felt right. But now, standing among the people who had become his family, he realized that he had found his true calling. As the seasons turned and the years passed, Darius continued to serve the community of Copper Hill with dedication and compassion. He became a fixture in the town, someone people relied on not just for their mail, but for a friendly face, a listening ear, and a source of unwavering support. The town thrived, its sense of unity and kindness growing stronger with each passing day. And in his heart, Darius carried the lessons he had learned from Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had taught him the true meaning of connection, resilience, and community. Her gratitude, her transformation, and her unwavering spirit became a part of him, guiding him as he walked his route day after day. Years later, when Darius finally retired, Copper Hill gathered to celebrate him, honoring the legacy he had created. They called him the Heart of Copper Hill, a title he wore with pride and humility. And though he no longer delivered letters and packages, he knew that his impact would live on, carried forward by the people whose lives he had touched. As he stood on the edge of the town he loved, Darius took a deep breath, filled with a quiet satisfaction. Copper Hill had become more than just a place on a map. It was a community bound by kindness, shaped by empathy, and held together by the simple but powerful belief that no one should ever be left unnoticed. And as he walked away, he knew that his legacy, the legacy of one mailman's quiet compassion, would continue to ripple through Copper Hill for generations to come.